Chapter 10. The Other Family. The Depression That Plagued Bruno Bettelheim as a young man in
Vienna, and that ultimately drove him into his brief analysis with Richard Stir that dogged him all his life. In Chicago, he rejected the kind of professional therapeutic help he constantly urged on others, and only rarely disclosed his demons to the outside world. But within the sanctuaries of his home, he often gave in to his dark moods, sometimes seeking refuge in bed, where his daughter Ruth, when still a young girl, would find him when sent upstairs by her mother to try and cheer him up. Superscript 1. His nightmares about the concentration camps developed over the years, but never disappeared, and reminders of his ordeal were never far away. In 1954, he saw The Life and Death of Colonel Blimp, the wartime propaganda film written and directed by the celebrated British team of Americ Berger and Michael Powell. The movie traces the lives of two fictional military men, the British Clyde Wincandy and the German Theodor Kretschmer, who become fast friends after fighting the duel in 1902. By 1939, Kretschmer is seeking political asylum in England as an alien. He is subdued and apprehensive, leaning on his black cane as he makes his plea to the interrogating officer, who is discouraging and suspicious, implying that the supplicant might well be a spy. Kretschmer makes a poignant speech about how evil the Nazis are and how much he loves England. The official asks if he has any friends in the country, and in walks Candy, who embraces his old comrade and says that he will vouch for him with everything I have. Bettelheim told James Farrell that he well knew the feeling of such desperation, recalling the frantic letters he had written after the Anschluss and later, in the camps, and of all the letters written for him to British and American friends. And the waiting. Will they know me any longer now that I really need them? Will they answer? Will they come to a rescue? Now I am secured as any mortal can be, well known in my field, supposedly friend, close friend, to some of the most influential persons, but there it was, as real as ever, when just seeing a movie, this past experience of 14 years ago, of being deserted, since it'll stay with me as long as I live. Superscript 2. Bettelheim rarely spoke of this burden with his children, whom he and Trude were determined to protect as much as possible from the impact of their exile. But no such catastrophe could be made to disappear. When Eric Bettelheim needed money in 1967 for his high school junior prom, he contemplated shoveling manure at the Chicago stockyards, the job he had heard paid $12 an hour. "You don't want to do that, I've done that," Eric recalled his father saying, clearly referring to the human excrement the guards had forced him to muck. Bettelheim continued to feel that people regarded him as ugly, small, and Jewish, that he would forever be an outsider despite his successes. Fears that fed on painful memories of his several childhood illnesses, his poor eyesight and the pop bottle glasses he wore to correct it, his father's prolonged struggle with syphilis and the gloom it brought to the Vienna household. A pall so lasting that Bettelheim rarely spoke of the affliction outside of his family. And then not by name, his feeling that his mother had often been distant and cold when he was a boy, his resentment at having to drop out of the University of Vienna and go into the family lumber business after his father died, his knowledge that, even had he been able to pursue his formal studies, an academic or professional life would have been difficult to achieve because he was a Jew. He had struggled with these entangled emotions while the House of Europe collapsed around him, starting with the breakup of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and followed by the disillusionment and carnage of World War I, the Depression, the rise of the Nazis, and, finally, the Anschluss, Dachau, and Buchenwald. When freed, he had rushed to Gina, but the woman he had pursued so ardently in the late 1920s, with whom he had lived for 8 years in their comfortable apartment in Heirzing, and with whom he had hoped to resume his life, told him that their marriage was finished. That she planned to wed Peter Weinman. Only a few months later, in Chicago, Trude had revealed her affair with Hans Bandler in Australia and the ectopic pregnancy that had resulted. And when this had pushed him toward the striking and well-connected Jean Friedberg, she, too, had turned him away. Various physical ailments compounded Bettelheim's dark emotional state. He suffered from chronic hay fever and was plagued by digestive problems, which he traced to the illness that he said had almost killed him as a child, and which had left his stomach scarred. Superscript 3. He stayed away from raw vegetables, fresh fruit, and cereal, and tried to be careful about the rest of his diet. Worse than his stomach disorder was the circulatory disease that gripped his distance between his home and the school. Painful, lumbar sympathetic, the surgical interruption of the sympathetic nerve pathways. The procedure reduced the pain, but standing and walking would remain difficult for him for the rest of his life. For Bettelheim was so convinced this disease would kill him that he told Ruth that she would have to be responsible for putting her through college, because he would not live long enough to do so. 5. In part, it was the same fear that moved him to sell for Stati his prized Sheila. The painting needed restoring, but Bettelheim had neither the money nor the inclination for such a project. He either sold or consigned it to the Marlborough Gallery in London for its 1964 Sheila exhibition. The following year, the Staatsgalerie in Stuttgart purchased the work for $180,000 Deutschmarks, $45,000 in 1965. At Bettelheim's death in 1990, it was worth at least twice that amount. 6. He knew the painting was a good investment, but his enthusiasm for collecting turned more on his love of art than on financial motivation. Moreover, he did not want True to inherit the Sheila, because he felt she was ambivalent about it since he had bought it as a present for Gina. In 1965, with the proceeds of the sale, he took the family on a trip through Europe, saying he wanted to show his children the continent before he died. As the superego at the orthogenic school, Bettelheim had to reject suicide as an alternative to getting well. But outside the school he made clear that he regarded it as a viable option. Suicide, by the French sociologist Emile Durkheim, often appeared on his reading lists. The book is based on a lot of statistics, and Bettelheim made them applicable, recalled John Ransom Phillips, who encountered the teacher as an undergraduate in the late 1950s. As he explained suicide, it became understandable and acceptable, because it was such a human act. He made me see that it was a legitimate choice, because it came out of a deep need. That deep need had been answered by scores of Viennese Jews, including Trude's aunt, in the days after the Anschluss, and by the prisoners who had jumped to their death from the Dachau-bound train, or who, once in the camps, cut their wrists, hanged themselves in the barracks, or ran against the electrified fences. Suicide was more common among Austrians than most other nationalities, and a number of prominent figures had resorted to it, among them Sigmund Freud's disciple, Victor Tusk, Stefan Zweig, who killed himself in Brazil after a long depression, the spy Fred Redl, the philosopher Otto Weininger, the physicist Ludwig Boltzmann, three brothers of Ludwig Wittgenstein, a brother of Gustav Mahler, Stahl, the daughter of Arthur Schnitzler, and Hans Joseph's only son, Archduke Rudolf, who killed himself with his mistress at the Imperial Hunting Lodge of Mayling in 1889.7. Gina Weinmann's brother, too, had committed suicide. Benjamin Wright told me that Bettelheim talked of killing himself from at least 1950 on. For one thing, he was afraid he was losing his sight. At one point, I was in the hospital with a blood clot in my leg, and he was on the phone saying his eyes were bothering him and that he might commit suicide, and here's what I should do at the school. I said, couldn't you wait until I get out of the hospital? He said, well, he was sure he was going blind, and he didn't want to be a burden to anybody. In the late 1960s, he would have a cataract operation on his left eye, and for many days lay recovering at home in bed with sandbag ovilizing his head, unable to read, unable to work but with hours to contemplate the worst. Bettelheim criticized therapists for too often concentrating on psychopathology, for emphasizing the tragic and spectacular and slighting the common aspects of normal life. He urged his colleagues to free themselves from their fascination with morbidity. 8. But he himself could not. In the late 1950s, Ida Marty Hallam often sat alone with Bettelheim late into the night at the orthogenic school. Hallam had come to the United States from Israel, where he had worked with disturbed children, and, like so many other staff members, found the director both fascinating and trying. He was reluctant to disclose the details of the director's post-midnight unbearings, but said, I can tell you one thing, Bettelheim had a desperate desire to be immortal and was terrified of dying. In late 1953, poor Bettelheim died. She was almost 76 years old and living in Newark, New Jersey, where Margaret, Bruno's sister, now married to a hotel maitre d' named Peter David and living in Manhattan, could easily visit her. Days after the funeral, Bettelheim wrote to James Farrell that though his mother was old and tired, her death had been unexpected and had caught him unprepared. Intellectually, I'm quite realistic that it was probably best for her, he told his friend, but emotionally it hit me quite hard. Trude bore the brunt of her husband's emotional and physical complaints. She listened patiently for months, frequently in tears, as he struggled with the immediate after-effects of his imprisonment in Dachau and Buchenwald. What spilled out in those days, or what else he revealed of his fears and insecurities over the years, remains locked in the couple's deeply private marriage of more than 4 decades. But her therapeutic ear was always open. She was absolutely devoted to him, their rustic view of how the marriage European men are taken care of by their women. She saw to it that he had food just the way he liked it, and made sure that when he slept nobody made a sound. Over the years, she became as much his selfless mother as his devoted wife. Though Bruno had initially hesitated to marry this woman who had adored him almost from their first meeting in Vienna, he soon became totally dependent on her, and they grew extraordinarily close. In the eyes of some neighbors, they seemed deeply romantic, an old-world couple often seen strolling along Kentwood Avenue arm in arm, like lovers in the Tyroler garden, true sometimes in the Dirndl. Bruno never let a special occasion pass unmarked and always kept his eye out for gifts he knew would delight her, sometimes buying a piece of antique jewelry months in advance and hiding it in a drawer until her birthday. They did not share a bedroom, however. Trude slept in the second-floor master bedroom, Bruno down the hall, an arrangement explained partly by the late hours he kept and his need for air conditioning to combat his persistent allergies. But he and Gina had not shared the bedroom either, because of their uneasy sexual relationship, and Bruno's nightly isolation from Trude suggests a similar tension. Trude had entered therapy with Etta Disturba in Vienna in part to deal with what she regarded as her repressed sexuality. Bruno had grown up traumatized by his father's syphilis, in a home where his parents had slept apart 4 years. In temperament, Trude was in most ways her husband's opposite, a sturdy woman who exuded the athletic strength of someone who had walked across mountains to freedom. Most of the time, she looked on life through a lens of cheerful optimism, even though she, too, had been robbed of her homeland. Her aunt had killed herself. Her parents, unlike her husband's moth, and sister, had died in the Holocaust. Bruno may have listened sympathetically to Trude's anguish and helped her through these and other difficult times. But, whatever his attention, there was never a doubt about who came first. In moments of despair, Bruno often sighed, "Oh, God." Trude never ignored the sign. If it turned out to be something that didn't seem to be so important really, she'd say, "Now, come on, Bruno, don't be silly, Bettelheim told me." But there was never any doubt about the person who was uppermost in her mind on all occasions, including when she dealt with us children. We just knew, and if we didn't, she told us, that in certain circumstances we just had to shut up and let her deal with our father. She would always come back to what our need was. But his needs always came first, and I think this was very, very important to him. It was essential. Trude saw her hand on the floor where Bruno could stand on it. Bettelheim's overpowering need was his work, which he told his faculty. Colleague David Reisman provided the only real meaning in his life. Superscript 1 degrees fatherhood did not engage him, even as a subject. His dialogues were with mothers, and on the few occasions he did write about fathers he warned that they shouldn't try to be mothers. Husbands who shared infant care with their wives did so at their peril, because the male physiology and that part of his psychology based on it are not geared to infant care. Fathers were better advised to stay away from the changing table and instead stand tall as models for their children by pursuing man's function in society, moral, economic, political. Superscript 1 When he wrote these words, in 1956, he felt that the father had become too much of an also ran in the American family. 11 years later, He spelled out the consequences in the Ladies' Home Journal. We read about all this increase in homosexuality and drug addiction, particularly among boys, and you begin to wonder if that's not the result of being born in a time when they're still expected to be strong, but never had a very strong father. Superscript 1 Superscript 2 in 1951, when Ruth was 8, Naomi 5, and Eric's birth not quite a year away. Their father told an audience that he had certain minimal standards that he expected his children to meet, and that's all there is to it. When a questioner asked what made him think his rules were necessarily right, he said that did not matter. He had earned a certain obedience because of the services he had rendered. Superscript 1 Superscript 3 Growing up under such a patriarch, who was often as despondent as he was dogmatic and stern, was not easy. By the time Bruno came down to break fast on most weekday mornings, Ruth, Naomi, and Eric had departed for school, and Trude for the Chicago Child Care Society, the neighborhood foster care and adoption agency where she worked from 1946 to 1965. For years his breakfast consisted of corn flakes, but when cereal proved to be a cause of his indigestion, the menu changed to a soft boiled egg, toast, and tea. These were served by Leon Brown, who arrived from the nearby Negro ghetto to clean the house and over more than 20 years would become a second mother to the children, especially Naomi. It was Trude, however, who left work each day early enough to comb the aisles of the Hyde Park Co-op or to pick up some fish at Jesselson for some pastry at Natchman's and come home to prepare dinner, which Bruno expected to be on the table at 7 o'clock p.m. sharp. A friend of Ruth's, who occasionally had dinner with the fellow, and the troops saluted. Superscript was sacrosanct. The one period when they could be together to hear about their children's day and talk about their own. Mostly, the dialogue turned on their own work, True describing her cases and Bruno discussing the orthogenic school and the other facets of his demanding professional life. This conversational lopsidedness led Naomi to cease speaking at the table, an absolutely willful shutdown prompted by her feeling that her father had no real interest in what she and her siblings had on their minds. Martha Friedberg, Jean Friedberg's sister-in-law, lived across the street from the Bettelheims and was friendly with the family. She recalled that during Naomi's high school years she never opened her mouth at the table, as if she were in a Bergman film. Bruno and Trude thought she was crazy. She wasn't. She had a fine record at school and lots of friends. She just didn't want to talk to her parents. Superscript 151 thing Naomi feared, like the children and staff at the orthogenic school and her father's students, was attack. By and large with women, and many men whom he did not see as his equals or superiors, my father could be quite brutal in arguments, and could devastate people without regard to the merits of their position. Naomi told me. I probably had experienced this at an early age, or saw it with my sister or my mother or others, and I had no interest in going through the same thing myself. Perhaps it was compensation for his insecurity, but he had to come out looking the best. The object of the game was always to make the other person look like a fool. After dessert, Bruno would ascend to his small bedroom, where he had a desk, and read counselors' reports or lie down for a brief rest. Then he would return to the school, leaving Trude to get the children to bed. It was she and Leon Brown who infused the household with warmth, twin female engines who, like the mostly female orthogenic school counselors, were expected by their foreman to do the heavy lifting, emotional and otherwise. In public, Bruno occasionally made sympathetic noises about the plight of women in a male-dominated society. Superscript 16 privately, he said that the stupidity of the women's liberation movement appalled him. Women should serve their men in bed like Scheherazade, and should concentrate on their purpose in life, which was to have and raise children, whether they worked outside the home, like Trude, or not. Superscript 17 Trude was strudel herself. Superscript 18 a sometimes disheveled house, frau with seemingly bottomless energy who served up hearty meals of meat loaf, pork chops, and beef stroganoff, brought flowers to the table from her cherished backyard garden, and welcomed her children's friends with snacks at the kitchen boisterousness. Her husband called nephew theirs, Gerhardt and Maria's son and one of Eric's high school friends. Trude would warn the boys to settle down, and after Bruno entered a hall often enveloped the house. Eric was a very bubbly, lively kid. His manner would change, and he instantly would become subdued. The whole household would. I don't ever recall Bruno sticking his head in the door and saying, "Hi, dear English," who, like the Bettelheim children, attended a laboratory school, the University of Chicago's elite academy for the primary and secondary grades. Babysat for Eric on several occasions when he was about 12. Trude would greet her and say that Dr. Bettelheim was upstairs in his study and was not to be disturbed unless there was an emergency. She would then tell the teenager what to make Eric for dinner and leave for the evening. I found it very peculiar, recalled English, who wondered why a 12-year-old needed a sitter with his father in the house, a father who did not emerge from his labors to join them for dinner or take a break to say good night when Eric went to bed. In eulogizing his father, Eric Bettelheim said that being his son had been a challenge, but it was probably less of one than his sisters faced. They were 9 and 6 years his senior, and grew into adolescence during their father's struggle to establish himself and make the family financially secure. By the time Eric turned 10, in 1962, Bruno was known throughout the world. Ruth was in college at the University of Chicago and no longer living at home, and Naomi would soon be off to the University of Wisconsin, leaving her Prince of the Roost. He fondly recalled playing pounds, canasta, and double solitaire with his father, as Bruno remembered playing cards with his father at about say 66. Eric also developed an interest in collecting old coins and went with his father to stamp and coin exhibitions. He would eventually become a lawyer, but in high school he was briefly drawn toward medicine, and Bruno found him a used microscope and an old lab table. It was very handy and exciting to have them. He encouraged me whenever I expressed an interest. I was not a particularly good student when I was younger. I only began to become serious at university age. But he didn't push me. What he communicated was not demands but just a wonderful sense of confidence. Such understanding is reflected in a letter Bettelheim wrote to his friend Morris Yanowitz when Ruth was trying to choose a college. He had urged her to go to the University of Michigan, but she opted for the University of Chicago. I guess that her old man wanted her to go to Michigan was enough to have her decide against it. After all, we too revolted against our parents, and a revolt against the school they suggest is so relatively minor one he clearly took a fatherly part, who had encouraged Naomi's interest in chess by sending her a book on the game, that pretty soon she will be able to beat me if I don't watch out. Superscript to degrees at the end of his life. He told another friend, "My 3 kids are so bright that they would have made it whatever their parents did." Superscript to superscript 1. He rarely spent the kind of time with his children that many other neighborhood fathers did with theirs. The Lincoln Park Zoo or White Sox games at Comiskey Park or family picnics were not on his crowded agenda. He and Trude occasionally took the children to a concert or the ballet, where Bruno would comment for their amusement on audience members whose fancy dress he thought unusual or striking, and on long car trips he sometimes distracted them by finding pictures in the cloud formations. But for Naomi at least, the overwhelming experience of her childhood was that he was not there. In an oft-told family story, the Bettelheims are visiting friends in California and Bruno is left to mind Naomi while the others go out. When she begins to paint her walls with the contents of her diaper, her father is unfazed and remains in his rocking chair happily reading until Trude returns to deal with the young artist and her canvas. Benjamin Wright said that Bettelheim kept Ruth, Naomi, and Eric away from the orthogenic school because he feared it would make the young residents envious. The feeling inevitably reciprocated. Eric told me that he felt great sympathy for the troubled young residents at the orthogenic school, and admired his father's dedication to them. But he also felt jealous, especially when Bruno would buy an expensive antique or piece of furniture for the school. The Bettelheims initially furnished their own home in the Scandinavian modern style popular in the 1950s, but as the emigres grew more confident in their new country, and more prosperous, the Spartan blonde look gave way to the rich texture of their European roots. Perhaps nothing symbolized this transition more than the late 18th century Dutch display cabinet in the living room, a vitrine reminiscent of Freud's and similarly full of objects, like small Egyptian vases and Ashanti coins. Many of these and other pieces Bettelheim acquired while poking around antique shops and galleries. in avocation that by his death had produced a trove of more than 360 items. By the early 1960s, Bruno had replaced the windows flanking the brick fireplace with bookcases, dimming the living room already darkened by an oriental rug and the somber moods of helping hands, a sign Kathy called its lithograph, and the soon-to-be sold Sheila. Bruno did not collect records, but he carefully selected those he had: Beethoven and Schumann, Schubert Lieder sung by Dietrich Fischer-Dieskau, Bach played by Pablo Casals, by Schoenberg and Mahler. The big Grammy played for a time, added to the old world flavors. Occasionally Bruno descended to a workbench in the basement where he repaired an electric switch or did some modest woodwork. His years in the lumber business had made him quite good with his hands, but he was not the person who bought tools. His extracurricular passions were reading and scouting for antiques. Because Bettelheim spent so many evenings at the orthogenic school, he and Trude had less time for social engagements than most of their neighbors, but they did attend the Chicago Symphony at Orchestra Hall and performances at the Civic Opera House. Even after these events, Bruno sometimes returned to the school and, still in his tuxedo, gathered with the staff until nearly midnight, talking of the very Mozart he had just heard and comparing it with an Otello or a Dotto Bani he had seen at the Stop Opera in the 1930s. Superscript to superscript 2. Despite his sensitive stomach, he relished sitting down at the bakery, a restaurant on Chicago's near north side where his friend Louis Chef Mario, the Hungarian chef owner, seduced him with such tasty hazards as smoked pork soup with liver dumplings, a boiled beef dish called ta spitz, crisp home-fried potatoes, and thin crepes filled with creamed spinach and Swiss cheese. Cabbage did not agree with him, recalled Chef Mario, but he loved it, and when he smelled red cabbage he would say, "Can I have a little plate?" If I live 3 weeks less for a wonderful plate of good cabbage, the world will not lose too much. He took the same position on desserts, calling Chef Mario in advance to say he would like to be surprised with Salzburg Granatapfel or Kaiserschmarrn, an emperor's trifle made of large, buttery pancakes scrambled into bite-sized pieces and then piled high with raspberries and powdered sugar. When the Bettelheims entertained at home, Bruno was the charming Viennese host, hovering over the guests and ensuring that all glasses were full, while Trude, whom he called his good wife, labored in the kitchen preparing a sumptuous meal, which she often served as a buffet. Such evenings were jam-biblic in part because Bruno was usually more benign with friends than in his classes, in staff meetings, or on the lecture platform. He was considerate, kind. "You didn't feel that he was playing hairdresser, Doctor," said Sophie Bloom, whose husband, Benjamin, was a fellow faculty member whom Bettelheim highly respected. However welcoming he was, however, his parties rarely passed without his taking the floor. Even in his house he tended to dominate, with his Eric Warnstroheim look. He loved argument, loved exchanges. Called the novelist and English professor Richard Stern, enough seemed to have an innate sense of when her husband had him full of her eyes and a gentle, "Oh," Bruno usually managed to end his monologues. Superscript to superscript 3. The high point of the Bettelheims' socializing came at Christmas, the holiday that always closed the distance between Bruno and his children. The family went downtown to Marshall Fields to see the tree and have lunch or tea, and on the annual expedition to pick out their own tree. It was the talk of Kenwood Avenue because it was decked not only with unique ornaments that Bruno had picked up in his travels but with candles, the Viennese tradition some neighbors found hellishly dangerous. Superscript to 4. On Christmas Eve, Trude lighted the wicks and the children were hustled out of the living room while their parents surrounded the trees with presents. At the sound of the Vienna Boys Choir or some other music emanating from the phonograph they rushed in to find electric trains, ice skates, stick animals, skis, or straw donkeys that Bruno had carried on his lap on a plane ride back from Mexico. Once wrapping paper covered the floor and the candles had flickered down, the family repaired to the dining room for Christmas dinner, after which Bruno returned to the school to help prepare for his other children's celebration the next morning. The family also gave an annual Christmas party for the school's staff, in advance of which Trude cooked for what seemed like days. As his guests they arrived, Bruno plied them with fish house punch, the potent mix of fruit juices, rum, and gin that worked to banish whatever anxiety they felt at being under their master's roof, and the conviviality usually lasted until well past midnight. These Americans were also impressed by the candles. "This is remarkable," Dr. B. Dennis Dugansko told his boss. "You have to come to a Jewish home to see what a real Christmas tree looks like." In the 1960s, Bettelheim sometimes faded the staff at the bakery, taking over the restaurant at lunchtime, when it wasn't open to the public. After singing carols in English and German, the gathering sat down to a menu of venison, Hasenpfeffer, Wiener Schnitzel, and roast goose as Bruno table hopped like everyone's wonderful daddy. Superscript 25 After Bruno celebrated Christmas morning at the school, all the Bettelheims drove to the North Shore suburb of Highland Park and continued the holiday with Gina and Peter Weinman and their daughter, Catherine. "I knew the Weinmans up until age 16, Eric told me. They were another Austrian couple parents' generation, obviously old familiars from Vienna. We went to their house on Christmas Day. They came to us on Thanksgiving, and on other occasions. Kathy and Naomi were good friends. Then, one day at dinner, someone said something at passing, and finally the penny dropped and I realized that Gina had been whom I hadn't been told. Naomi said too, but the fact is, nobody had bothered to tell me. They just assumed I knew, and it was no longer a matter of concern to anyone." The two couples, whose reconfigured marriages had been performed by the same judge several months apart in 1941, established a relationship right from the start, when the Weinmans had settled in Hyde Park for a few years before moving north. Bruno had always gotten along very well. Superscript 26 with Peter in Vienna, and despite Gina's defection, the two men remained friends, bonded like their wives and others who had fled the Nazis, by an upheaval that dwarfed any marital awkwardness. When Naomi was born in 1945, it was Peter who took True to the hospital. In 1947, the couples took a summer vacation together, traveling to Estes Park in Colorado with their 3 small girls. Naomi and Catherine, who were the same age, often pretended they were cousins, and on many overnights giggled over Bruno and Gina's former status. Thinking the whole business quite risque. Superscript 27 as Bruno had gravitated to the Buxbauden's apartment in Vienna to be with his cousin Edith and to escape his sister and the oppressive atmosphere of the Bettelheim home. The two girls looked for comfort in each other's families. Naomi, caught between a father who favored her older sister and a mother who doted on her younger brother, envied Catherine's position as an only child. She sometimes fantasized about living with the Weinmans, where she was always welcomed by Gina, who was impressed by her precocity, and where the soft-spoken Peter was the antithesis of her self-involved, often domineering father. "When I was a child, I always viewed it as if I had 3 mothers, Trude, Lily, and Gina," Naomi said. "We both idealized what the other had," Catherine Weinman told me. She felt intellectually inferior as a child and admired Naomi's considerable verbal skills, an articulateness that it seemed to her all Bettelheims possessed as a matter of birth. "I felt I just couldn't keep up with them." By the time the Weinmans moved to Highland Park in 1950, Gina had begun to practice psychotherapy, and Peter was well on his way to becoming a distinguished oral pathologist at the University of Illinois. But by the end of the decade he was dying of cancer, and during the months of his illness Gina and Catherine often stayed with the Bettelheims to be closer to the hospital. When Peter died in 1960, just after his 64th birthday, Bruno was eager to fold Gina and Catherine into his extended family and encouraged them to move to Hyde Park, where he could better look after them. They didn't, and Gina soon settled in San Francisco, but Bruno kept in touch with him, and that for many mitigated his more difficult years. Substantial contributions to Catherine's support when she was in training as a child therapist at Anna Floyd's clinic in Hampstead in the late 1970s. She had been 15 when her father died, and in the months that followed she sometimes hoped that the strong man who sat at the head of the family she so envied would take over Peter's role. Like so many others, she saw Bruno as larger than life, a forceful father, therapist who knew the answers and could envelop her with care. But as she grew older, she began to see that he was not always right, and that he found it impossible ever to admit he was wrong. "I loved him, but he was a very flawed man,"